senior counsel at Marsh Law Firm, here to talk about the Maxwell trial once more. Bob, thanks for joining us again. And
you're welcome.
What are the major revelations from week 2 of trial, Bob?
The major revelations from week 2 of trial was the testimony of 3 additional survivor witnesses. It was Carolyn using her first name only, Kate using a pseudonym, and Annie Farmer using her real first and last name. Although each of them had their own particularized stories about the recruitment and abuse that they suffered at the hands of Epstein with the aid and comfort of Maxwell, the essential pattern that was laid out by Jane in week 1 was found in all 3 of their testimonies. That would include their first being approached or recruited on the promise of some sort of help with their careers or their education, along with help financing all of this, and then being brought in and Maxwell herself grooming them with talk of sexualized talk, with talk about taking them shopping, about asking them about boyfriends, asking them about their schools, asking them about their dreams, and pretending to be their friend and confidant of sorts. And then this leads into the massages, which were sexualized according to the 3 witnesses. So that was the essential and most important part of the week, the testimony of those 3 witnesses.
And what makes these witnesses' testimony believable in your understanding?
I think several things. First of all, you had to be there, which the jury was, obviously, and that's the reason we have this kind of trials in our system, is so that a jury can look the witness in the eye and hear the testimony live and see them under first direct and then cross-examination. And from my observation, all 3 of these witnesses were credible just by virtue of their demeanor and the fact that they had come forward and were presenting a story that, quite frankly, is not particularly flattering to them, yet they nonetheless were coming forward to tell the world what had happened to them as young women. In addition, there were corroborating witnesses and evidence. The corroborating witnesses, depending upon the particular witness, would include, for instance, boyfriends to whom they had said things at or about the time of the abuse. In one instance, a mother who corroborated the story. And there was also corroborating documentary evidence. In one case, FBI agent testified to finding a document in the home of a mansion of Epstein here in New York, which seems to have been authored by Miss Maxwell, which describes in great detail the very close relationship between her and Epstein. In one instance, saying they are, quote, never apart, close quote, and talking about their similar interests and so forth. So I think that is strong evidence that Miss Maxwell knew very much in intimate details what Mr. Epstein was doing throughout his life, at every aspect of his life. There were also photographs found in the search of the mansion in New York, which were shown to the jury. There must have been 20, and they showed Maxwell and Epstein kissing, hugging, doing all sorts of activities together, and I think suggested once again that Maxwell was intimately involved in virtually every aspect of Mr. Epstein's life. And this rebuts one of the themes that the defense has been using, which is to argue that somehow Mr. Epstein, quote, compartmentalized his life and was able to hide all of the pedophilia going on from Mrs. Maxwell.
And what do you think the defense's case will look like if they're up at these kinds of defenses?
Well, it's my understanding that they have their ace in the hole, at least according to them, is the testimony of an expert in memory who will in some fashion testify that sex abuse survivors do not have good memories, and that the sex abuse itself may have, in some ways, especially over time, may have corrupted their ability to remember things. They also have subpoenaed some of the lawyers who had represented these witnesses in civil lawsuits. It's not clear to me how that testimony is going to be admissible over an attorney-client privilege objection, or how their testimony will be particularly relevant. But they have indicated that they're hoping to call them as witnesses. And finally, although I haven't heard this, I believe they may also seek to call FBI agents who interviewed these witnesses. In several instances, the witnesses were confronted with the FBI interview reports and said that they did not think the interview reports were accurate. It wouldn't surprise me if defense lawyers call these FBI agents to confirm the accuracy of those reports, and then they can argue to the jury that they have the choice of either believing these witnesses whose memories have been in some ways corrupted by the drug usage and by the time lapse, and versus the memory and the reports of these FBI agents. I would say in that regard, though, that for the most part, the inconsistencies that were brought up by defense and cross of these witnesses were what I would call collateral, not essential discrepancies. They didn't, for instance, say that they were abused on the witness stand and then somehow say they weren't abused in their interviews with the FBI.
And do you believe Miss Maxwell will testify in her own trial?
I would be shocked if she did. I have heard and read in the paper that at least her representatives are saying that she very well might. I think that's a smokescreen. I would be very surprised if she testified.
And do you feel that the prosecutors have presented a convincing case so far?
I think that the prosecutors have presented a solid case, and I would say a relatively clean case. And by that I mean that they have kept it relatively simple. They have only presented 4 survivors, and everybody in the press is asking why not more. I can't answer that question, but I would just say that they clearly have decided to try to keep this fairly narrow, straightforward, and simple. And in that sense, they have, I think, presented a very solid case.
And do you think that they are hitting the same themes with all 4 victim witnesses?
Yes, they are, and I think they've done a good job on that. And they also recall, in the first week, they presented the testimony of an expert explaining the grooming process, how that works in child sex abuse, in all sex abuse, but especially child sex abuse instances, and about the fact that most child sex abuse survivors have delayed disclosures. And that expert testimony, I think, was very helpful in framing the grooming process for the witness, for the jury early on, and the pattern which that expert laid out has been shown to be true in all 4 of the witnesses' cases. So once again, when it all is pulled together, I think it presents a compelling case.
And do you think there were any missteps by the prosecution? Do you have any major criticisms about perhaps their preparation?
Well, I would say, number one, that it's easy to criticize when you're watching a case as it unfolds, but we don't know a lot about what the prosecutors know or knew, and all of the facts and evidence and decisions that they had to make. So I'm a little reluctant to criticize from afar. The one thing, having said that, that I do question and ask is why they didn't do a better job of preparing, especially the earlier witnesses, Jane in particular, for cross-examination. She seemed like a deer in the headlights. She didn't really seem to understand what the FBI reports that she was being asked to review were about. All things that I think probably should have been discussed with her before she testified, and apparently were not.
And do you make anything of the prosecution's plan to rest their case earlier than we expected?
Not really. You know, as cases are presented, it's often the case that witnesses that the prosecution or the defense thought initially might be called aren't because of this, that, and the other reason. It's always the case, and it's the case in this situation, where both sides are required by the judge before trial to give the other side a witness list. And you want, when you put the witness list together, to side on err on the side of caution by being over-inclusive, because the last thing you want is to not include a witness that you then decide you want to call. So typically those witness lists will be longer than in fact the witnesses presented are. And so it doesn't surprise me that they're finished in 2 weeks, and they originally said it may take them 3 or 3.5.
I know we haven't gotten into the defense's case in chief yet, but what missteps did you observe from the defense so far, if any?
First of all, I'd say that the defense team is very capable. They have a lot of experience in both as prosecutors and defense lawyers, and I think they're doing the best they can with what they have to work with. One criticism I would have is they are trying to point out every particular inconsistency between the testimony and what these witnesses said to the FBI or said in depositions. And in some instances, I think the inconsistencies they're pointing out are quite minor and inconsequential. And the problem they face is at some point the jury begins to think that they're being unreasonable and actually begins sympathizing with the party who's being cross-examined because the difference is really inconsequential. If I were doing it, I would highlight and focus on the major inconsistencies and leave it at that.
And what would a guilty verdict in this case mean for survivors of Epstein and Maxwell's abuse, as far as you can say?
It would be huge. Look, the survivors in this case, but you know, sex abuse survivors overall, have for many years been ignored, told to shut up, go away. People don't want to hear about it. And in this particular case, as we know, the government back in the mid-2000s knew very well what was going on and seems to have tried to essentially hide the facts from the public. So these survivors have waited now decades for this day, and a guilty verdict would tell them, number one, that they've finally been heard and listened to and taken seriously, and that would be very important for all survivors of child sex abuse.
And what do you think an acquittal would mean for survivors of both Epstein and Maxwell's abuse, but survivors of child sex abuse at large?
I think it would be tragic. I think that it would set back the cause of those who are trying to help sex abuse survivors come forward by decades. I think we would have a situation where many survivors would decide that if they did come forward, they would be pilloried and criticized and ignored again, so why bother? It would also send a signal to pedophiles that they can continue to engage in this activity with impunity, which is obviously tragic, as I said.
And what would a guilty verdict in this case mean for your client, Sarah Ransom?
Like all survivors, she would be feel vindicated and heard, and she has been on the out there in the forefront of this effort to bring attention to the Epstein situation, but child sex abuse generally, and it would mean that she was heard and listened to.
And how might a guilty verdict in this case shape the ongoing global conversation surrounding child sex abuse and sexual abuse at large?
Once again, I think it would help to advance the cause and encourage child sex abuse survivors to come forward and discourage all those institutions which may be negligently or intentionally enabling child sex abuse to do more to cut it, to prevent it, as well as to send a to those who might have an inclination towards that to stop.
And what do you expect to come in the next 2 weeks?
The court is going to be in recess next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Back in session Thursday and Friday. I expect that the defense will put on its case Thursday and Friday. They may go into early the next week, but I expect that in the next week, which is the 20th, the week of Christmas, the jury will hear closing arguments. The judge will instruct the jury on the law, and the jury will get the case on the 21st or 22nd of December.
And in your opinion, does the holiday season impact this case or how the jury will deliberate?
Yes, because of the recesses, which are going to be taken on the 23rd and 24th of December, as well as the recesses in the next week, there's going to be disjointed consideration by the jury of the case, which I don't think is particularly good either for the prosecution or for the defense.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bob, for your time. We appreciate you being here. We look forward to asking you more questions after the next week of trial.
You're welcome.